And to me, like, this is how and why Bitcoin's going to go to 2 million, to 20 million, to 200 million, to 2 billion. My golden reserve of Zimbabwe, this is a $100 billion note. And I think that that's the direction we'll go. And if we go into that highly inflationary environment, it makes sense to me. We get pretty quickly a $10 million Bitcoin, but it also means a $50 gallon of milk and a $70 carton of eggs. When you go through one of the 4-year cycles and finally Bitcoin pops and, maybe you can double or triple what your savings have been. Instead of me having, 50,000 in savings, I have 200,000 in savings. Like, now that's the difference between me being closer to retirement versus me actually having a nest egg for me to go off and do my own thing that's really important to me. So I think, in a weird irony, by the way, that the United States government choosing Bitcoin as their core asset will also be their downfall. Bitcoin's only 16 years old. I can't imagine that another 16 years passes and that we haven't dramatically changed the outcome of the global political landscape. Yeah, it's pretty wild. It's 2025. Bitcoin's totally got inside of the Overton window. I'm just shocked at how extraordinary it is. There was that little video of I forget who it was. It was some central banker, but he was like, oh, we're supposed to have a Bitcoin strategic reserve and a banana strategic reserve. And all the other people are like, what are you talking about? This is a real asset and it's important.
What is your take on just Bitcoin attack surfaces? Do you see anything? Is it just human attack surfaces, just education not being there? When you look at Bitcoin as a whole, could be the system, the people inside of it. Where are the attack surfaces that you're kind of is it mining centralization pools? What are the things you're kind of looking at that you're need to put energy this way?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because we sort of go through this cycle in the same way that we go through our 4-year cycles. But mining centralization is something that's pretty dangerous, particularly from a KYC standpoint. Same thing with education. I think in my opinion, the biggest thing going on right now is sort of classic cypherpunk crypto anarchist values right now against number go up status Bitcoiners. So I'm personally not a fan of the Bitcoin strategic reserve just because I think we can get to hyper Bitcoinization without the state owning a bunch of the asset. And I think it's pretty dangerous for the state to own a bunch of Bitcoin. Mark Goodwin's Bitcoin dollar thesis, I think is quite accurate and I think is the pathway that we're going to take. Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see, I just got back from El Salvador. I was at the Plan B conference down there to kind of check it out. And I was surprised to see how much Bitcoiners were really cozying up with the Tether people. And it's strange because it's one of those things that I don't know. It feels like there's this dual Trojan horse thing, kind of where Bitcoiners we'll cozy up with the Tether people and allow for them to finance our ideological operations. And it feels like the Tether people feel the same inversely.
And so it's two Trojan horses passing in the night. Is that what the new saying here? Is that instead of two
sort
ships
of?
passing in the night?
Well, it's almost who's fucking who here? And I don't think we get the whole play of that until we actually see how everything unveils. But to me, at the bottom is that the sovereignty that cryptography provides and the ability for Bitcoin's base layer to do really powerful things and provide people the ability to transact freely and privately is really powerful. With that being said, we're not in a place where I'd want to be ideologically or technologically. The fact that most people aren't running full nodes right now or being able to use things like silent payments is really important. That's a really important technique and piece of technology that allows for the preservation of privacy that is almost non-existent and not being used right now. Not to mention, if we do go full CBDC through the Tether route, there's a very real possibility of being able to taint so well that trying to move Bitcoin within the system, despite the fact that you can freely transact, it might be surveilled in such a way that trying to move that Bitcoin around would be very difficult. So I think these things are disturbing that people need to be aware of. And I also think that there are some people that are I don't give a shit about privacy or other things. I just care about number go up. And for them, maybe that's good enough. I have a very hard time seeing how Bitcoin with just number go up without preserving privacy, without providing the freedom to transact, how that's still really what we want to have. Because for me, the thing that I'm so bullish on with Bitcoin is that this isn't just an American project. In my opinion, this is really about an idea of getting, those first 5 amendments that are enshrined in the U.S. Constitution to everyone everywhere. Like, it's really important to me that people in China have the ability of freedom of speech, to be able to transact freely, to be able to have access to information that could allow for them to create firearms if they need to. And like, it's really great that like the Liberator plans are inscribed on Bitcoin's blockchain, that anyone anywhere can look at that information directly now. And so these are all really powerful techniques that, personally, as a cypherpunk, like, I really want to see these things expand and grow and become more powerful in the world. But I think a lot of people need to look deeper into like what really is the purpose of Bitcoin other than just number go up, because that is an important component of it. But what else does it provide? And does number go up work if that's in your ETF or if that's just part of MicroStrategy? It's something that I think people have to self-reflect on a bit for themselves and what they want to see in the world.
Do you think so? Kind of along these lines, I got a couple of things to think of. A couple of things. Like, what do you think of Saylor and what he's doing? Just in like, is you think he's positioning to be the biggest Bitcoin treasury bank? Is it becomes, does it get folded into the American government at some point? Like, what when you look at that well, I guess it's strategy now. Sorry, but Saylor and what strategy is doing. What is the case on outlook when you see all that?
Well, first of all, I'd say, like, he's playing a fundamentally different game than I'm playing. Like, you don't get to be a billionaire in America and not be playing that game at that level.
Mm-hmm.
And that requires that you have golden handcuffs to an extent. If you look at Saylor's background, considering he went to West Point, where he's been located at near Washington, D.C., his location towards Langley, like, I don't think it's a far cry to say that he could necessarily be an asset. But again, it's like that Trojan horse thing. Like, I don't know if he's a double agent or a triple agent, because like, from my private dialogues that I've had with him, like, he seems to get it through and through and understand this. And so like, if I'm going to put my own harebrained crazy conspiracy theory out there, like, I think he was probably an asset. I think MicroStrategy was probably put in place to get in on the original tech stop pump in the 2000s. I think after it crashed, because I have friends that do a lot of politicking in Washington, D.C., and they said that Saylor isn't a highly regarded person within Washington, D.C. Like, he's seen a bit as an outlier and like is not somebody with a high reputation, at least until recently. And so like, I think he's felt a bit jaded about that. And I think when he discovered Bitcoin, he sort of was like, here's my path out of this. And essentially realized that he could transform MicroStrategy into a play on Bitcoin to essentially create a Bitcoin bank. And I don't know if that's like a wider conspiracy theory that involves American intelligence agencies or not. But I do think, with that being said, like, he is now well positioned to become the most powerful bank that will exist into this new future wave. And, it would seem... it would seem improbable that he wants to do like hardcore cypherpunk vision. And it seems like this is much more state-based. Let's become a Bitcoin bank and a treasury for the United States. And frankly, like, this seems to line up with the Bitcoin dollar thesis of, why don't we abandon the Fed, allow for the US dollar to inflate infinity, and then we'll turn around and we'll create a new asset that we'll peg to Bitcoin that we can continue playing out in the exact same way that we've done fractional reserve banking throughout human history. But in some ways, like, this is kind of a better version of it, because like, now we have a transparent fractional reserve banking that we can issue debt on top of Bitcoin and keep that peg to it, or float it somehow with some sort of nominal rate to it. And like, I think that that's an interesting and decent strategy. I'm still deeply disturbed by the sort of surveillance that gets enabled with that. But like, this also definitely gets us to like, a $30 million Bitcoin, which would be awesome. And to me, like, that's kind of, again, like the ongoing Trojan horse thing that like,
right.
I think when you make it so that hardcore cypherpunks who have believed in this vision from the start have gotten wealthy in the way that they do, sort of ironically, just by the methods of how like Austrian economics works, like, these people are now going to provide the substrate and the very real capital allocation to creating sort of their renaissance, which we're already seeing. So I think, in a weird irony, by the way, that the United States government choosing Bitcoin as their core asset will also be their downfall, because essentially they create a lot of these dissidents to become very wealthy and build the tools that they want to see in the world.
And ironically, it's the people that are getting wealthy, like you said, they're the cypherpunks. They're a lot of the libertarian crowd. You know, you get a lot of these people that are very self-sovereign, high agency, and that's the people that come to Bitcoin first and then have the high agency and then become wealthy. So it's this weird transfer of wealth. I mean, like you think of like, I don't know, Genghis Khan, you think of like guys who are just very brutal or violent for thousands of years. And it was like, they are the ones that, I guess, you know, you could say, hey, they have high agency. They just said, hey, F it. I'm going to go take over. I'm going to beat you over the head and I'm going to take your resources and steal your women. And now you have this world where seemingly, you know, we're all still human, but you have these people that are hopefully more altruistic, right? That's again, like it's monetizing the greed quotient, and that's what hopefully Bitcoin will continue to do. But it is this weird transition to, like you said, the Trojan horse. So it's going to eventually have these people that become very wealthy that are the arbiters of this system and keeping everything and being diligent with it. So anyway, that just, it's fine. But the other thing really quick though, I wanted to mention though too, was coming back full circle to the CBDC on Tether type of thing, which is again kind of what we're dancing around a little bit. Like this is that, again, that Trojan horse thing, and this is where it's fascinating. And I don't know the Tether guys. I don't know if you know them, but like everyone's like, oh, they're hardcore Bitcoiners, But does that not prolong dollar dominance? And now it's on Bitcoin. It's just like roundabout way. Like we're in a fascinating time. I don't think most people even understand how wild the time is where we are, like just today, just in the last week or two here.
Yeah, I'm friends with another number of the guys that are pretty close with the Tether folks, and I would agree with the fact that they are actually pretty hardcore Bitcoiners. And I think like their sort of ideological approach is a bit different. Is that like they're like, look, if we get Tether on Bitcoin and we compel this whole vision and allow for Bitcoin to become a reserve asset.
If you're liking this interview, but you're just wondering, hey, you know what, Brandon, this is amazing stuff. And I get you have these guests on and they're talking about how orange pilling the world is so great and how Bitcoin is going to take over the world. How in the world do I educate my family and friends? How do I get people to understand what most people just don't care about, quite honestly? Bitcoin trading cards is the way to do that. When you open up these cards, you see the foil cards, you see the chase, you see the glossy cards, young, old, boy, girl, man, woman, it doesn't matter. People love these cards. It's awesome because they're super valuable, by the way. Amazing little side note. However, it Trojan horses them into the most important thing of the day. It's not politics. It's not all the things that we fight about. It's changing the money, fix the money, fix the world. Bitcoin trading cards is the best way that we have going in order to do that, no matter who you are. You're gonna love them. Playable Characters 10 for 10% off at checkout. Playable Characters 10 off at checkout. btc-tc.com. You're going to absolutely love these things. Now back to the show.
Like the ability to be able to switch between Tether to Bitcoin is really easy. Making sure that the US dollar survives over, say, like a Chinese digital currency is important. So like there's a number of compromises that go on there that, looking at it at straight on, like it seems to be like a pretty fair compromise for what we need to deal with, and it plays in the real politic in a way that I think is really important. Again, I think the irony is that because these Tether guys are some hardcore Bitcoiners, they're also developing tech and supporting ideology. You know, like Plan B is ran by Giacomo, and Giacomo is like a hardcore Bitcoiner who ideologically aligns with me in a lot of ways. And like they're primarily funded by Tether. You know, like the way that I square that circle is like, I think Giacomo has like a pretty thoughtful approach and consideration of how it's done. So like these are all the things that like I sort of compromise with, but also like I think as things develop, like there's no way to get around the need for like the ideological educational approach. Like people need to know and understand why Bitcoin exists, why it functions the way it does, why you need to have Bitcoin as your chosen vehicle of savings, and like why, you know, perhaps something like Tether ends up becoming a great medium of payment, but you absolutely don't want to have it as your storage of wealth for the very real reason that Bitcoin has 21 million units and Tether does not. And I think most Bitcoiners go, yeah, duh. Like I think you go to a boomer and try to explain this to them. They're like, but isn't it all crypto? And it's like, look, like I'm not going to be able to help you until you help yourself. And like that's going to require a fair amount of reading and understanding. And frankly, this is also kind of one of the places where I've noticed like a pretty big discrepancy between like our generation and that came before us, is that like growing up with the internet, we were sort of forced to like figure stuff out on our own, and like being able to like, like I remember in high school, like my teacher being like, Wikipedia is like not a legitimate source of information. Like you shouldn't be able to use that. And like now it's seen differently, not that it's authoritative, but like that's a great place to garner information. And so like I think we have a worldview where we understand that like we can actually dig through information and resources and assess them for ourselves to come about to what the truth is. Whereas I think the generation before us, like they're so used to the route authoritarianism. And like I use this word authoritarianism like a big way of that, like watching the news is like a legitimate source of information. Like they wouldn't lie to you. Why would they do that? Like same thing. Like if I go to my doctor,
Yep.
like his primary concern about my health is like, why wouldn't he be concerned with that? And like,
Yep.
it's that secondary question that like they don't actually stop and go like, yeah, like why wouldn't he be concerned with that? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, no, like that's like a legitimate question. And like I'm trying to tell you that like he actually gets a lot of money from pharmaceutical companies and he sees you like 15 minutes twice a year. Like he doesn't give a fuck about you. He gives a fuck about writing you a prescription for fentanyl because he gets a kickback for that. And I'm like, oh. Like same thing, like the, whoever you're watching on the news every night that you think you have a relationship with, he doesn't even know who the fuck you are. What he cares about is saying the things that his boss told him to because his boss gives him a fat paycheck. And they're like, oh,
funding from USAID.
Yeah, exactly. And like it's also hard because the other one that I've noticed is that like looking at the truth of these things is really dark and disturbing. Like that's the thing that came up in COVID was like, they were like, I had this dialogue with people. They're like, you legitimately think that they would give us a faulty vaccination in order to make sure that they can continue to do that later on? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, no, like that doesn't make any sense. Like, why would they even do that? And it's like, well, the answer is banal. Like, it's because they can make money. And they're like, really? You think somebody would do that for money? And it's like, absolutely. It reminds me of, there's a great scene from Breaking Bad where like they're negotiating, like getting a guy hit, and they're like, yeah, like 5,000. And Walt's like, hey, hang on, whoa. He's like 5,000. He's like, that's a lot for like getting somebody murdered. And they like haggle it down. They're like haggling over hundreds of dollars to like murder somebody, and they like agree to it. And that's sort of what it's like. And a lot of people don't realize that like there's a lot of people in this world that like ethics isn't a thing at all. Like they just have a nihilistic viewpoint. And it's like, why shouldn't I try to get as much money as possible? It's not like there's some greater judge in the world or any problem with this. I'm just watching out for myself. And like, it's really disturbing, but it's important to understand that some people see the world that way.
So funny you say that. And that's the one of the couple things I really rack my brain over. And it's, it's like, why, Brandon? Like, why do you think, like, why do you ask yourself that? Like, it just is, humans are just like that. A sect of the population, or a large sect of the population. I remember my grandfather was like 15 years ago, and I think it was the 2008 election that really changed him. And he grew up in the unions and voted Democrat his whole life. And he was Hillary. And then all of a sudden she got rug pulled. And here comes Obama. And that changed him. He's conservative, him and my grandmother, for whatever last 15, whatever that is, like 15, 20 years ago. And that was where he was like, whoa, like that was his moment of like, well, they're just playing a game on us. Like everyone, the media, everyone's saying Hillary's the lady, it's her turn. And then all of a sudden this guy comes out of nowhere and like, oh, they just cameras focused over here and like, no, this is the guy. And that changed him. Like, and I also had this conversation with him in that same, when we sat down and talked about this, he was like, yeah, I mean, like, you just got your news from Walter Cronkite, and like, why would you believe anything different? Like, they told you there's no reason to not believe what was happening. And because I asked him, like, well, why'd you believe like this was the lady? And then all of a sudden the media just turned. He's like, well, like our generation is just the handshake generation, like they just, why would you believe anything different? And it's just like, that to me is like, how can millions, tens of millions of people just think like that and not ask a second question? Like you said, I mean, that just baffles the mind. It's like we're animals using our five senses and not our higher faculties of reason, intuition, willpower. Like we're not animal. I mean, we have these animal senses, but you don't have to just use those. That's what separates us, guys. It's like, it's really wild.
There's something that's really beautiful about that kind of naive outlook, right? Is that like they sincerely believe, like, why would somebody lie to me? Like, like my neighbor next
which
door
is beautiful. Yeah.
And so like being able to have that worldview, I think in a lot of ways shows this sort of underlayer of that there's like something really wonderful about the human condition. But with that being said, furthermore, like a lot of times we'll map on these personal relationships to the greater world, and we forget that like in the greater world there's a deeper alienation that occurs, and because of that alienation, a lot of times that allows for a sort of exploitation to be able to occur between people that don't actually know each other in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
And like we all sort of have to have our own lesson of being disturbed by that, whether it's, you know, being robbed by somebody or seeing that somebody's willing to exploit us, and allowing for you to sort of go through that cycle of going, oh, you know, like maybe I shouldn't be so trusting. Maybe I shouldn't have such a naive point of view. And some people never get over that for their own reason. To me, the big thing is that like I don't want to be forced into a world with that naive outlook, you know, like I don't, and it's the same thing. Like I really appreciate a lot of the stuff that Trump is doing right now. And I think it's really great. Like I'm not naive enough to think that like he's some wonderful champion of democratic values who's going to like be an all loving and embracing father. Like, no, like I think that very similar to how Bitcoiners have regarded him is like he's been a good ally up till now. And I think that having the stinky crypto finger shoved in Bitcoiners' eyes is going to be like a disturbing difficulty for a lot of status Bitcoiners who thought that like he was just going to get on the Bitcoin train. No. And like I think what he did with his Trump meme coin is a perfect example. And furthermore, like I love that he rugged all of the people that piled on with that. Like I think that was a great lesson for him to deliver to people. But it's important again to just like have a thoughtful and balanced outlook of that, like, you know, and this is kind of the same thing with the Tether is like, it's okay to have strange bedfellows if they're going to help you in furthering your cause, but like, don't be surprised when they double cross you or betray you. Cause like, that's sort of what the whole relationship was predicated on in the first place. So,
it's like getting, you know, like you're with somebody and like you go and cheat on someone else and then you're like get together with that person, then they go and cheat on you. And it's like, well, what'd you expect? Like that's your relationship started from an affair. Like,
yeah. And like, you know, and I think that one of the nice things is that, and I've found this repeatedly is that for a lot of people, what really changes them with Bitcoin is like this shocking revelation that like the code itself can't actually lie to you. And that like the promises that Bitcoin delivers are like a true technological innovation and not just this promise that like a man makes. And like, that's also why the cycles of Bitcoin operate in the way that they do, is because like it's not a man-made promise, but a technological one. And like that's why, despite the fact that it keeps going up and to the right forever, that like it'll probably keep doing that because it has nothing to do with you know, like any person that's been holding Bitcoin since its birth has now, for the most part, sold it, you know, and like that's because it's just had such unbelievable gains that like there's no person that can just hold through all of that, I guess, except for Satoshi, which brings us to a very different and interesting conversation. But it's really powerful. And I think for a lot of people that offers this sort of redeeming quality of going, oh, like there are certain things that we can create real agreements around, but like we need to essentially have this surface area using technology to kind of create those agreements as opposed to just the words of man.
What are your, so Satoshi, like what's the interesting rabbit hole that you're alluding to? I'm curious.
That like he understood what he was creating was something that was sort of monumental in the concourse of humanity. And that first of all, like being an actual human being or body, like was a total impossibility through it. So like he couldn't do this as a Donald Trump or a Joe Biden or any human being or any sort of political purpose. And that he had to actually use perfect forward secrecy in such a way to like vanish behind the shadow of cryptography. And furthermore, like, I think he destroyed his keys as soon as he sort of made the whole system up. Like, I don't think he saved it for the future. I think he sort of understood how dangerous it was. And I think that's why when like WikiLeaks sort of got on the train, he sort of realized like, oh shit, like this has gotten a lot bigger and a lot faster than I thought. And like, I need to get away from this as quick as I can. And with that, he sort of solidified the mission of what Bitcoin was as it being something truly political. And that's why he vanished when that sort of political apparatus got activated around it. Because, like, you know, it's not like this was a traditional political party or anything that scared him off. It was that he realized that a journalist had leaked constitutional war crimes that were committed by the United States. Because like the documents that WikiLeaks leaked, that Project Spartacus actually inscribed these on the Bitcoin blockchain as a statement about it, was like these were very real documents that prove that the United States military in Iraq murdered journalists. Like that's a war crime. And so I'm pretty sure Satoshi realized the very real power that Bitcoin had to help fund a journalist organization that was exposing stuff like that, and how dangerous it was from like this capital T, capital P, the political standpoint. So at that point he fled. And I think with him fleeing and being able to protect his identity, he sort of delivered the strongest statement of what Bitcoin is and what it could do.
Yeah, it's funny you say that too, that like that's when he left, right? When I was interviewing Max, I think, it was after the Nashville conference last year, and it had just ended. I think Trump had just talked or something like that, or whatever it was. And
which Max? Max Hilbrand?
Oh, sorry, Max Kaiser.
Okay,
sorry.
cool.
I thought I said his whole name, but my mind's going too fast. So I was trying to think. It just made me think of him, and I was asking him. I was like, what sets you apart? Because like, love or hate Max, he'll say what's on his mind, right? And there's not even a lot of Bitcoiners won't always say what's on their mind. And this is like, now we go back to this problem of people not voting with their mouth, voting with their feet, voting with their wallet. They're like scared to like have the agency to be like, oh, I can do these things. And I was like, what sets you apart? What allows you to go, and he's like, I'm not really going after the people that kill you. He's like, the military guys, they'll kill you. If you go after and expose the military stuff, he's like, they kill you. He's like, I was going after bankers. Like, they don't do anything. They don't care. Like, they just print up more money. Like, it's fine. So it's funny that you say that about Satoshi, because like you said, he's like, oh shit, this got really real. Like, this is, war crime stuff. Like, so after, it's just fascinating.
Well, it goes to show the power of cryptography too. Like this is fundamentally a technique of war. Like it's not like cryptography was just developed to have secrecy and communication. Like it was, I mean, the computer itself was developed in World War II to be able to perform cryptic analysis to break the Enigma code. Like that is why the first computers were developed. And that's also why cryptography is at the forefront of all theaters of war. So like, I don't think it's coincidental in any way that like it just so happens to be that cryptography is the substrate that makes the Bitcoin system work, because at its deepest levels, it does connect to war, which is one of the reasons why, we're seeing what Bitcoin represents in this day and age with the exposure of what the Trump administration is showing. And, like USAID is just the tip of the iceberg. And I think it's going to be pretty interesting that like,
yeah,
I think there probably will be very serious political crises, because it's also clear that like Elon Musk is a bulldog in this, and that like he's going to plow super hard forward on this. And I won't be surprised if they do actually audit the Pentagon and they do audit all of these entities that have been performing these massive crimes. And in the exposure of that, like Bitcoin's probably going to go up and to the right, as it will continue to do, because people will realize, oh shit, our government is just a gigantic slush fund to do black ops and other things that, are morally reprehensible and truly part of this gigantic crime. So.
Yeah, it's so wild. And again, we were talking about this earlier too, a little bit. There's I think it was American Affairs, the magazine in like the 40s. And it was from, I think his name was Beardsley Rummel, who was like the New York Fed head. And the title of the article was Taxes for Revenue are Obsolete. And it literally outlines in bullet points, like 4 or 5 things. Like, this is why we tax you, just for redistribution of wealth. And, among a couple other things, and just like basically to coerce you to do things. And it's like, it was there. Like it's been there for anyone with ears to hear and eyes to see. And it's just like, how are we at this point still? And people are like, oh, what I can't believe this is happening. Like you said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, can you imagine people start finding out like, what was it actually doing? Where did the money actually go? What politicians were paid off through all these things? I mean, every organization is like this. This isn't just like, oh, this one thing is doing. No, you got to go through every organization in the government, and they're all going to show the same kind of garbage that's going on. That's what's truly mind blowing. So
this is part of the ideological advancement that we have as Americans now, is like not only do we have real tools to actively resist this stuff, but like now it's a question about, do the principles of what America was founded on mean anything at all? And I think it's really terrifying, because I think on one level, the idea of really engaging in these ideas and principles is a real struggle. And also like, you know, to me, it's like quite logical. Like when I tell people like taxation is theft, that's still like, you know, like it'll stop the music at a party.
Yeah.
And like, to me, like that's not,
Like common.
that's
Like,
not a
it's
far
not
stretch
common.
at all. That's just something true. And
Right.
I think people being forced into reasoning through that will be really helpful. But also at the end of that, there's like a real choice that needs to be made. Is that like, if the principles and values of America are actually meaningful in any way, why do we have this gigantic rogue apparatus of the federal government that steals from us on a bunch of different levels and uses it to do a bunch of things that don't seem to be in the Constitution at all? And should we tolerate that? And like, as wild as it seems, I do feel like there is a zeitgeist going on that if somebody chooses to really make a decision to powerfully lead through and towards this, I can absolutely see a powerful movement building over the next decade that will proceed to dismantle the federal government, empower state governments, and create sort of a new dynasty of what the American project is supposed to be. But like, that's going to require very strong ideological leadership that's going to challenge a lot of the notions, that's going to force people to think. And I think we have the tools to do it. But again, it's like, one of the big ones is like I personally feel in a lot of ways like the generation before us, like they're not of any use at all to us, and that they're not interested in having dialogue or creating meaningful change. Like they're interested in allowing for a lot of the same that has happened over the last 30 years to continue to happen. And I think the generation after us is like they've been ripped off enough and are spiteful enough that they look at the outcome and go, well, I'm obviously never going to get Social Security, so why should I be paying in for, you know, this boomer that was able to have, you know, like there are people that could easily be, they could have been a clerk at a store their entire life, and that meant that they could have 2 cars and a nice family home, and because of the way that the system played out, they were able to ride on that. That's not to blame them at all, but like that person is uninterested in rocking the boat at all. Whereas the same person starting out right now doing that, like, they're barely going to be able to pay rent and probably not actually be able to afford groceries, nonetheless provide for a family and have any opportunity to retire in a meaningful way. And so I think a lot of people are pretty interested in something new and different because they see how much that this political system has robbed them, and neither right nor left at this point in time provides any meaningful solution whatsoever.
Yeah, and you talk about the tools we have now. I mean, one of those being Nostr that you mentioned earlier, just the tech in general, like what's going on. I mean, I like the weaponized autist as we all talk about with Bitcoin, right? I mean, like that's, I mean, like, and I think you talked about it with Hodl and Walker on the pod there a couple of weeks ago, and it's just like, it's true. I mean, like we memed, between all of us for for 20 years, really, this generation, like kind of going around like, what is going on? And then that just grew and grew and grew. And it turned into Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, which were 2 sides of the same coin, in essence, when media told us we were fighting each other. Again, I was telling you, that's what woke me up before we came on air. It was just like, what the hell is going on? And then you have this tech enabled generation where we're on social media, which that didn't exist really, truly until after 2012 it started. And that's why Donald Trump got in a way, because people are like, wait, they're communicating with each other like we never could before with real social media 2.0. And now we have this ability to quickly get information around. Now you have the weaponized autist, all of us, memeing our way into office, memeing our way into whatever it is. So it's like this, people don't think they have this ability to change things. And I think you even mentioned this about the fight you had with your parents too, in the previous pods, of just like, no, one person can do something, like, because if I'm doing this and then Brandon's doing it and then Walker's doing it and all these people are doing it, then that changes the system. If you're just going to sit here and be like, well, can't do anything about it, then yeah, you're just going to have Genghis Khan coming full circle. You have Genghis Khan come in and burn your village down. And I think
I think one of the big things is that like we who identify as Bitcoiners have essentially made a decision that like this is what it is. Like we're not, like, I've never met anybody who's a Bitcoiner who like reneges on that. There's never a time where like, you know what, like this is a terrible idea. Like the fiat thing's great. There's Bitcoin derangement syndrome, where you get people like Richard Hart, who goes off and like creates their own shitcoin to rip people off. But like that's a different brand of nihilism. But like there's not a point where it's like you understand what the promise of Bitcoin is and you renege on that. And so like we've fundamentally made a decision about like what the future is going to be. that I haven't found any other contingency of people that have made a similar decision in any meaningful way. Like the best that they offer is a capitulation and a collapse on allowing for things to continue to progress in the direction that they've done. So for me, like that means we've automatically won. In addition to like this last election's a pretty great example is that like within a year of David Bailey pretty much unilaterally deciding that like he's just going to bankroll Donald Trump and make a difference of the outcome of this election. And like that came about from the Democrats making an absolutely asinine and retarded decision that they were going to attack crypto, specifically after like their little pet project, Sam Bankman-Fried, like he bankrolled the 2020 elections more so than anybody else. Like if you look at the numbers that he donated to Biden and to all of the Democratic Party, like the numbers are absolutely insane. And like that's not part of the dialogue anymore. And like that also looks like it was part of like a greater intelligence project that has some pretty interesting connections. But so I mean, for me at this point, like we already have won. It's just a matter of like how long of a time span are we going to allow for this to play out on, and how aggressive do we want to be? Because like also Bitcoiners are the only contingency of people that truly are actually speaking towards what's going on in a meaningful way, because like we have this weapon where like you can't cancel us. And then because we started getting canceled on places like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, a Bitcoiner decided like, hey, I'm going to create this new protocol for notes and other things by Relay. And now we're getting to use that. And for the first time, we have real social media. And the hilarious thing is like, this isn't a social media protocol. This is just like the first implementation of how we're actually using this new model that's really powerful for a number of different ways. Because like, essentially like really what Nostr is like it's creating a bunch of dumb servers that like you have smart clients with. So it sort of inverts the relationship that you've had through computational science throughout the development of the internet. So like now we actually have the substrate from what like we can build a totally new internet that's actually free and actually open and can provide for all these really, really strong value sets that, in my opinion, allows for us to have for the very first time a truly free and open conversation about what the hell is going on and how the hell we're going to address it in a meaningful way. And I think it's pretty clear that Bitcoiners have a very strong ideological and economic presentation of how we can do that meaningfully.
Yeah, I could not agree more. That's so well said. I want to circle back just for a moment to the Tether stuff and, you know, kind of like the CBD stuff. What's going on there? Is that not because like the XRP stuff, all the bullshit that's going on right now with, you know, the scam coins, shit coins, altcoin garbage, you know, and people have been obviously, you know, Bitcoiners have been rightfully going after that, which the funny part of all this is it's always like, you always have like the crypto crowd is like, just let the free market play out. Just like, you're like, well, how come you're not, you guys are free market people. I thought it's like, yeah, the free market also allows me to be free in educating everyone else that you're running a Ponzi scheme. Like that's the part of the free market, you moron. Like that's just how it works. Like, so does the Tether thing, does that kind of render like, I bring up XRP because that's obviously been the thing in the news lately with Brad Garlinghouse and the pictures of Trump, and who knows how much XRP sold, dumped on his army in order to pay Trump for that picture. Like we have no idea, obviously, but it's like, does that kind of render like XRP moot at this point? Because their whole thing was like, we're banker coin, all the banks are going to use us and be the CBDC. Like Tether pretty much just I don't know how that didn't go to zero. Like XRP should have gone to zero basically in the last week here because of this announcement. Does it not? I mean, like that's like,
I mean, to me, the whole pitch that XRP is trying to do is essentially that like we are going to do politically conniving shit and try to allow for us to twist the arm by bribing whoever is in the administration a way to get a pathway to issue our own CBDC. And frankly, like they could probably be successful in this, and that like I think the ultimate game that plays out here is like there's not going to be one universal winner, but that essentially we'll probably do something similar, like figure out a way to start rolling back the Fed and essentially saying, hey, banks or other entities can all issue their own private USD currencies. And like that will legitimately be new forms that we can do. And there will be lending on top of that. And I think it's also stupid because like the XRP bros are going to be like, this is so great. You know, like now that I have my digital dollar here, and they're going to go buy something that they're not supposed to, and their XRP will get frozen. They'll be like, I don't understand. Like, this was cryptocurrency. It's free. Like, nobody's supposed to. And again, like, this is the long-term market thesis playing out, is that, like, as a Bitcoiner, I believe in the free markets unequivocally, but like that means something fundamentally different from most people, what most people believe. Like, I don't think there's such thing as illegitimate markets. Like, if you want to buy and sell things that are illegal, like, while that is not recognized as being legitimate in the eyes of the US state, like, to me, it is economic activity that is occurring. And like, so that is a real thesis that allows for those things to function and a very real value. You know, so like, if someone is going to buy something in China that is restricted, like, using XRP is probably a pretty terrible idea for a number of reasons. But if you want to try it out, go ahead. Same thing, like, look, like, if we throw Brad Garlinghouse off a building, like, the price of XRP is probably going to go down, like, a lot. Like, I don't know who I throw off a building in Bitcoin to, like, do the same thing. Like, same thing goes for Ethereum and Vitalik. Like, and again, this goes back to the whole cryptography thing that we were talking about earlier. It's not, Satoshi Nakamoto was not an anonymous person that used cryptography because, like, he just thought it was like a fun and quirky idea. It's that he understood the very real and extreme political risk that was involved with it, that I don't really feel like Brad Garlinghouse or Charles Hoskin or whoever is building their own cryptocurrency actually understands. And it's not so much even that I can throw Brad off the building, but like, I can get compromising pictures of Brad with 9-year-old boys in bed and be like, hey, Brad, like, we were thinking of exposing all of these pictures of you, and like, you know, or giving them to the State Department or whoever. Maybe you should do the stuff that we want you to do for us now. And I think that that's like kind of a gross and sad truth that a lot of people don't understand, is that the human component creates very real vulnerabilities to the entire system. And so, like, same thing goes with a guy like Vitalik. Like, I think he is captured in a very real and meaningful way and is going to bend the Ethereum ecosystem in a direction, whether openly or not, because of the way that he has been captured by various interests. I think it's just a very human thing that I think Satoshi very actively understood, which is why he's not a human, as far as we know. We don't know what he is. Maybe he's a dog, maybe he's a cat, maybe he's a person from the future. But the very important thing is that there is no body that can be tortured or extolled in any way in order to get it to bend to our very political needs. So I find that's really important. And, you know, with that being said, like, I'm open to the idea that I'm missing something here. So like, if people want to go make their big bet on Ripple, I think that's kind of insane when, like, you know, I remember when they were giving away, I think it was like 150,000 Ripple for anybody who just joined the ecosystem in like 2012 or something. So, you know, like, again, returning to looking at the very real and logical facts of like how and why these things were created is really important, because I think Nick Carter wrote something in like 2017, which was like the excellent quintessential takedown of Ripple and why it's a pretty thoughtless project. So,
yeah, no, it's so good. I'll try to link to that too. What Satoshi, like, I think what people, and I'd love for you to unpack this a little bit, and your book, you know, Crypto Sovereignty as well. I mean, it's such a, and we'll link to that too. Obviously, people have to check that out. You know, Satoshi was the end of the line. Like, it was, when people say like it's the discovery of fire, there's many, or Bitcoin being the discovery of fire, or like, you know, the wheel or something like that. There's many reasons that that people say that, or Bitcoiners say that, but one of them is that we have been, like you said, encryption came about as this militaristic thing we were doing for decades, and then people were trying to find value on the internet and how to move that across the internet. And the discovery of that, it took that long to figure that out and bring all these things together, basically, right? So where I'm going with that is I'd love for you to just unpack, like, people think like, oh, it's going to be like better tech, like this, you know, Cardano or like whatever. And it's like, no, that's, we've been working on this. Bitcoin was the end of the line. It wasn't the beginning of the line. It's the end. And so I would love for you to just kind of unpack that a little bit, just some of the history of that, and for people that might not know, or just new to Bitcoin in general, or the crypto world.
Yeah, I mean, like it's like a pretty big question to unpack, so it's difficult to kind of cover all of it. But like the first of all is like the reason that Bitcoin uses proof of work as opposed to like a proof of stake system is that like it's really important to understand like the real substrate and value that Bitcoin provides is through allowing this computational chain of proof of work of showing like how much computational energy was used specifically to find the next block. And so like it's also really important to understand that Bitcoin is essentially this gigantic lottery that's based upon how much computational energy that like you're putting into the network. Well, now you have to return back to like first basis of like, well, why would that be valuable to society? Like, why do we want a society that is using high amounts of computational energy? Well, like it turns out, like if you're an advanced technological civilization, like you need very real computational energy. In fact, like computational energy is in fact probably the great measurement of the value of your society and the direction it's going. And this is one of the places that stuff gets really interesting and powerful when like I don't know how Satoshi had the foresight to be like, oh, you know what, like AI at some point in time is going to need massive quantities of both information and data to be able to operate in a way, and like Bitcoin just so happens to counterbalance that in a powerful way. But like that's all part of a really interesting and powerful concourse of thought, because like now you're starting to return back to like these sort of like first principles thinking of like what is the most important thing to our society, like why would we want to have computers and a cryptographic contract be able to actually secure Bitcoin as opposed to like having that be a promise from the Federal Reserve. Oh, like let's look at some history, like what happened with the first Bank of the United States and the second Bank of the United States. And like, why is the third bank of the United States actually the Federal Reserve? And why is it called the Federal Reserve when there is nothing federal about it and there is no reserve currency that's involved or any reserves that are actually involved with it? And so to me, this is where it starts kind of unifying with philosophy itself, is that like you have to start asking these bigger questions of like, well, what even is the purpose of having a government in society? Like, why are we having governments issue a currency as opposed to gold? Like, what were the very real problems with gold? Like I thought gold was supposed to be protected by the law. Like, oh, it turns out that like the law itself is the thing that like expropriated all of the gold. Like, huh. And like these are all super big questions that are really difficult for most people to handle because like and like this is a place that I get frustrated with my mom is like I just want you to like ask one question and follow it. Like just follow that line of thinking. And a lot of people just get really intimidated. And they're like, I just don't understand any of it. I don't even know where to begin. It's like, well, you begin where the first step is. And like if you don't know how money's created, maybe start there. If you don't understand what supply and demand is, maybe you start there. But I think that's something that Bitcoiners sort of universally share with one another, is being able to say, hey, I don't know about this thing or this aspect of it, and I'm curious and I want to know more, and I'm going to look into that for myself because that's important for me to be able to understand this. And I think that that's in contrast to a lot of society where you're essentially told from an authoritarian model that like you don't know the answer. You need to ask the smarter people than you for the answer. And the answer is something that is rigid and defined. It is not an open-ended question that is about the pursuit of the question itself. It is about getting to the answer. And that's why you need to go to school, go to the right college, graduate with good grades, get a high-paying job, marry somebody that aligns with your values. Like, don't question things. Don't look at a bigger picture. Just follow what you're being told. And for me, like that wasn't a world that ever worked for me. And frankly, like I hated that world. I hated everything about it. And I hated that it didn't leave me with any degree of agency or empowerment or the ability to be curious, because I was doing all of the stuff that was supposed to be the right way, and it made me absolutely miserable. And I think a lot of people feel that way. And I think also like it's pretty terrifying to think that you don't have power, that you can't find answers on your own, and that you're just supposed to listen and follow what the authorities tell you, and that things will turn out to be okay. And if you read anything in history, it turns out that not only will it not only be okay, but if you do that, there's usually a lot of times that you'll either find yourself the victim of these systems, or even worse, you'll find that you'll become part of the system that's victimizing people.
And it goes back to a lot of things we're talking about, right? Like agency, just being high agency, accountability, responsibility, and like there's obviously like there's the 1% or the whatever 1/10 of 1% of people in life who, whatever, they have issues, whether it's physically, mentally, like that stuff happens, obviously. But how you can't have 30%, 40% of the country that acts like that. Like that's not, the math doesn't add up. Like it's just like where has all that gone? And that's where like
Well, this is a real breakdown of it's a real breakdown of values. And I mean, like, I think it's funny because this is a place that I've gotten more extreme, is that like I realize, like, I think the American public education system is really destructive, and not because like I think it meets a number of like quite basic standards to sort of quote unquote educate people, but inside of it, like there's a ton of insane propaganda that really allows for sort of a dismissal of personal agency and responsibility in a really meaningful way from the very basic construct of like what it is, of that, like, the government's responsible for educating people, and if they don't do it, who will? It's like, yeah, if they don't do it, who will? And then like, it's funny because there's this interesting moment where we're like, yeah, like that's the question. I'm like, yeah, it is the question. Like it's you, like that, like if you have kids, you should be responsible for teaching them. Like it seems, I don't know, it seems insane to me, the idea of that, like I'm supposed to go take my kids and like leave them with a stranger, and that stranger is supposed to like embed values inside of them. And then one day they come home and say insane stuff to me, and I'm like, where did that come from? It's like, well,
that's weird.
Yeah, like you relegated responsibility away from yourself to like not educate your own kids. And it was funny because I talked with Daniel Prince about this, and he was like, because I was a little anxious about doing homeschooling with my kids and stuff. He was like, no. He was like, your job is to like keep them from being indoctrinated. Like that's really what it is. Because he was like, I let one of my oldest go to school for a while, and he was like, I realized when she came home and was sharing some stuff that I didn't agree with, that like that was really problematic. He was like, furthermore, like you'll find that giving your kids the empowerment and agency to know that they can help themselves and solve their own problems. And he was like, this doesn't mean that like you're not going to need to help give them direction and educate them on stuff, but more of that you really move to a model of empowerment, that you can solve things on your own, and that you can be responsible in a way that leads all the way through. Because like, how can you really show your kids that you're going to be responsible towards and for them if you're offloading them to some place 5 days a week where they have to do a bunch of stuff that doesn't even make sense? And like, then you start to realize like, oh, we're actually indoctrinating our kids to do a bunch of stuff that like doesn't make any sense, and reinforcing that. And like, that's really disturbing, because you're like, your kid's like, why am I doing these math problems that I obviously already know and understand, that like when am I really going to need to use Pythagoras' theorem? Or even more importantly, when am I going to need to actively identify that? And it's like, yeah, that's like a pretty good point. Not to mention that like me and my son, we've been doing a bunch of stuff. Like he's had like an AI tutor that he's been using that's been kind of cool. And he's moving away from that. So we're talking about like, let's install DeepSeek on your computer and like do some modifications of it so it can be private. But like, to me, this seems to destroy the entire educational model from top to bottom, and that we need to start really actively thinking about how we want to take responsibility for ourselves and what we learn. Because if not, like, it's a pretty dangerous future we go into. And so I think Bitcoiners are really good about doing that and understanding that like everything can actually be reasoned through, but like we have to connect that full line of responsibility that I think most of society does not want us to actively engage with. And I think that's why you have the classic move of like, whoa, fascinating. Like, did you catch the game last night? And it's because like, it's just hard stuff to think about. And it's, and again, like I want to empathize, like it is hard to think about, and it can be really disturbing if you don't have the tools to think about. Like I'm going to struggle to have a good conversation with you, but like I do empathize.
Or it takes a long time. Like I've had numerous people that, and it's funny you say about the homeschooling. We went through the same thing. Kids went to school for a couple of years, really good, private school, and like had no issues with the school. The school is amazing, but I just, what we do, like our job is very mobile, and like what I do and my wife, and it's just like, wait, like why am I actually dropping you off in the morning? Then like I go home. And it doesn't make any sense in kindergarten, first grade, and you're like, it's just glorified daycare. It's like, okay, like I can't have you all day long. And it was just like, what? But we've just been trained to think like that all day. And like some of these conversations we have with people, to what you're alluding to as well, I've had many people that were, well, Brandon, I mean, I get it. Like I totally, I agree with what you're saying. Like, what do I do? And it's like, we're so like people are so trapped on the hamster wheel. Like it's like this long process, which it does. Like you empathize because it takes a while for all of us to get to these, whether it's a decision or it's like physically like, hey, I'm in this job. Like I run this whole company. It's like, well, yeah, it might take a few years, it might take 5 years, but it's like, you got to start somewhere. You got to start chipping away at it. Cause that's like, how do you remove yourself from that hamster wheel? And it's everyone's answer is different.
Well, that's kind of the coolest thing about like the Bitcoin epoch cycle with what happens every time that the supply is chopped in half is that like it causes for a supply shock that usually causes for a bubble that seems to align with the business cycle. And usually like, I don't know, there's just this really interesting and fascinating feature that like the 4 years it takes of people really kind of cutting their teeth on doing the work and understanding Bitcoin, but also like taking on like the quote unquote risk of what it means to like convert one's savings into Bitcoin. Like, yeah, like that should fucking freak you out. Like you should be terrified of Bitcoin going to zero. Like all of these questions that come up are really important in the concourse of proof of work so that you can be like, yeah, like there is a fundamental possibility that Bitcoin could go to zero. That's just as true for the dollar or any other human asset. Like, so why wouldn't it go to zero? And doing again the proof of work as opposed to what the contemporary system wants is proof of stake. Like the central bank will never let the dollar fail. Just trust me. And it's like, okay,
me,
well, if we look at history, like, is that something we should actually trust? And like, again, returning to the nomenclature of like, don't trust to verify. Like, well, I can actually verify why Bitcoin can't just create new coins. Like I can't do that with the dollar system. And this is all really, really important. And I feel like as people really build up their own proof of work and, building on each successive block of information that they get, there starts to be a real robust understanding of, oh, okay, yeah, it seems like Bitcoin is something that I can actually trust more than the dollar system or gold or a number of other things for various reasons. And I'm going to choose to stake my wealth in that. And then when you go through one of the 4-year cycles and finally Bitcoin pops and, maybe you can double or triple what your savings have been, that now becomes a bootstrapping mechanism that you go, oh, like instead of me having, 50,000 in savings, I have 200,000 in savings. Yeah. Like now that's the difference between me being closer to retirement versus me actually having a nest egg for me to go off and do my own thing that's really important to me. And so I find there's just this really beautiful kind of blooming that happens from people asking those questions on their own and choosing to take a risk on themselves and trusting themselves first, as opposed to taking on the authority of a system that frankly you shouldn't trust, that you're told to trust. And usually it betrays most people. And even if it doesn't betray them, it usually like the best it can do is get close to its promises, but it's definitely not going to over deliver on those promises. Whereas it seems that Bitcoin kind of does the opposite.
Yeah, it really, I mean, the fiat is just such frog in the boiling pot. It's all it is. I mean, right? It's just like you can verify Bitcoin, like you just said, and you can't verify what's actively going on other than ironically the USAID or USAID stuff going on. Like now we're getting some verification, but you can't, for 100 years, you couldn't verify what the hell was going on. That's the problem. However, people can go back, like you said, if you just asked why, once or twice, a couple of times, you'd get back and see all fiat currencies in all human history have failed. Every single one of them. That is verifiable. Like we know these all fail. And it's like people have this frog in the boiling pot mentality of like, well, it's different this time. Like it's going to be different. That is just, again, just mind blowing. We were talking about cycles too. What are your thoughts on just a super cycle at some point? Do you think it'll always kind of be just this ebb and flow because of the supply shock? Or do you think there will be at some point it'll be, is it this cycle? Is it 10 cycles from now where you're like, you know what, I think this might be the trigger where it just kind of just balloons?
In all honesty, like I don't think the super cycle thesis is actually going to play out. I think what will end up happening is like, we'll just have standard cycles. Whereas like, recall that like a standard cycle again for this time around would be like if Bitcoin hit like $2 million a coin, like in the next 2 years. And I think we'll see that ongoing because the other one is like, I'm not so concerned about like Bitcoin's price point as much as I am like what, like in 2030, what does $50 mean? Like right. what's a gallon of milk cost? What's a carton of eggs cost? And like,
Yeah.
particularly with Trump, because like if I'm going to take a shot in the dark from what I see is like, it looks like Trump's going to tariff the shit out of all the other countries, that he's going to essentially force Jerome Powell to cut rates like dramatically, that he wants to accelerate inflation, so that we will have 40, 50, 80, 100% inflation. And that now allows for us to actually pay back the U.S. debt in a meaningful way. It's going to destroy middle-class savings, but if you have the United States government encouraging people to pile on to an asset like Bitcoin at the same time, I think that there's like a meaningful shot that you can go to a highly inflationary environment and not absolutely fuck the shit out of the middle class. But the only way that that's going to happen is if people are thoughtful enough to help themselves in this situation and realize that, as John Maynard Keynes told us in his economic theory, in his general theory of unemployment, like money should not be used as a storage of value. In fact, like only an insane person would see it as a storage of value. And so like we need to return to that, of that, like people really need to understand that the dollar is supposed to be a medium of payment. It is not supposed to be a storage of value. And I think that that's the direction we'll go. And if we go into that highly inflationary environment, it makes sense to me. We get pretty quickly a $10 million Bitcoin, but it also means a $50 gallon of milk and a $70 carton of eggs, which like we're not far off from that. Like I was explaining to my son, I was like, yeah, when I was a kid, a gallon of milk was $2.99. He was like, whoa. He was like, no way. I was like, yeah. And while it's scary, I think again, I don't know. I find it pretty extraordinary how absolutely irresponsible people are with like not understanding finance. They're like, oh, like that's, I don't know about economics, man. And it's like, well, you use money though, right? And I'm like, well, of course, yeah. And it's like, so like it obviously affects you and is involved in your life. Like, don't you think you have some responsibility to like getting how that works? But, as I always say, it's like, for me, this is really difficult because like there's been people that I've been going to for a decade trying to explain this stuff to them, and they haven't listened to me. They're in the same position, if not worse off than when I first came to them. They've seen how much of a difference it's made in my life. And I would just expect at some point that they'd be like, hey, like you seem to have really changed your life and like made things different from yourself. And like this Bitcoin thing seems to have helped you a lot. Like, could you explain it to me? Like, it's happened very rarely. And again, it just sort of returns to the point of that I feel very strongly that the vast majority of people are not interested in trying to help themselves, but are interested. And like, this is a product from that education system, is that like, it's really broken a lot of people in a way that like, they can't think for themselves or help themselves because they've been taught learned helplessness. And, they're like, look, like it's been a long day. Like, I just want to turn on the TV and like relax for a bit. And it's like, well, maybe that's part of the problem. Like maybe that's why you're still in the same circumstances you were in a decade ago, is because instead of you getting home from work and being like, man, like that was awful. Like I really hate that and I don't want to keep doing that. I'm going to study a bit and figure out how to get myself out of these circumstances. You just sort of collapse into that. And it's unfortunate, but it's a choice that a lot of people make.
Yeah, it's like you said, that learned helplessness. It's school, government run schools for decades teaching people that it's just true or false. Like life is just binary outcomes, just true or false. It's black and white. It's, pick something on the Scantron, and it's just like, that's not how life works. It's holding opposite ideas in your head at the same time a lot of times. And there's gray areas. And that's something that you can't get that from government schools, and it makes me think of also, you can't we're talking about this mechanism of schooling. And this is where I go back to, like, I've been in spaces in the last few years, or even just back and forth on Twitter, like with George Gammon, for example. It's just someone I always come back to and have kind of fought with or debated with over time. And his big thing is like, I get Bitcoin, all these things, and him and Jeff Booth have these debates, and it's like, yeah, like we're on the same page. I don't think you need to educate these people though, because at some point it'll just fall right back into the same thing, which I agree that you need to educate people, and you just alluded to that earlier. We're talking about this right now, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. We could just be off with our kids right now or doing whatever else, but we're called and pulled to do this, to educate people. But it's like, George, at some point you have to remove the funding mechanism from the state, because we're it's the matrix, and we all are in the pods right now, and they're sucking the energy, the life force out of everyone right now to out propagandize you, to out educate you through the government run schooling apparatus and the media. Now we know it's going to Politico, it's going to these other areas. You can't outrun that. It's a speeding. It's like, hey, George, go swim up the full Nile River. You'll kill yourself trying. And like, that's the game we're in. You have to remove money from state in order to get this done and to educate people.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't expect folks like George to get it. And that's why I'm going to be like, look, like me and my people, we insist on that. Like, we're just not going to participate in that system. We're going to put all of our time, energy, and wealth into this other system. And because of the way that your system is built, like, it will inherently inflate to infinity. Like, that's how it's designed.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, this other system will continue to accrue wealth. And furthermore, because you have positioned your system as a storage of value, as is ours, we're going to compete on that level. And because we have a fundamentally superior product, that's going to become very, very difficult for you guys to actually compete against. So again, into the free market, we can do that. But also, like, I think one of the other really important things is that, like, this is just a really powerful tool for freedom and really represents like what true American values are. And again, at the end of the day, like, I believe in the agency of humanity and what it means to do that and allow for people to make the choice about who they want to be, how they want to exist, who they want to interact with. And like the USD system does not provide or support that. In fact, it seems to do quite the opposite of saying we're going to give all of our power to the government. We're going to allow for the government to choose the winners and the losers. We're going to allow for them to choose what the interest rate is and who we fund and finance, and who will also cut off and take the ability away for them to actually engage in banking relationships. So, and again, like, this is sort of the beauty of the whole thing is like, I'm not out here being like, suppress the, you know, the retards in the XRP army or USDT. It's like, no, we can freely compete with you, and we have a fundamentally superior product versus what you have, like, on a number of levels. So like, yeah, if you want to compete in that way, let's do it. You know, like, it's kind of interesting because like the XRP thing, like, because they don't have mining or any way to support themselves outside of proof of stake, like I don't see any like very real world innovative capacity that it allows for it to change. Like, if you look at what some of the developments that people are doing with creating like new mining projects that are based off of either geothermal or hydro mining, like specifically hydro mining in sub-Saharan Africa, like, it's incredible. They're like bringing electricity to villages that have like never had it before. And like, this isn't some fun NGO powwow project. Like, this is like, these guys make, I've seen the books for some of these guys, like they make such good money right now that when they do approach VC financing, the VCs are like, what's wrong here? Like, your numbers are too good. Like, why are you making this much money? And it's because they're doing something that's truly innovative, you know? And like, it turns out that giving power for somebody to be able to run a washing machine in sub-Saharan Africa, where they used to have to walk 4 hours each way each day, is like something that they're ready and happy to pay for, that actively improves their life, because now they can actually spend a whole nother day of the week actively farming in this rural part of Africa. So, yeah, like I see the innovation across the board in really powerful and interesting ways that, frankly, is exciting and is really going to augment the way that society develops. And I hope that America is going to get on board with that, because like, this is our one shot to spread these values to the rest of the world, particularly against something like the Chinese panopticon that's ever expanding right now.
Yeah, it's so well said. And it's spreading the actual real values of the American ideals of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. It's not the woke color revolution BS. And so that's why I think it's so good that you illuminate that, because and I think you said this earlier too, today. I don't think it was in the other pod, but it's the first time in human history where you can, without being on American soil or maybe an embassy somewhere in the world, an American embassy, where you have the ability where the Bitcoin white paper and the network is allowing those ideals to spread around the world and not just have to be on the soil in America to get the benefit of the law of the land. So it truly is unbelievable. And I was going to ask you what your favorite part of Bitcoin was, and again, we talked about being ungovernable and just allowing you to, that's why you brought up the mining, which I think is, we haven't even scratched the surface on that and what's happening to what you just alluded to. And it's like this ungovernable aspect, obviously, of the state. Hey, you're gonna do this. I'm like, no, you're not gonna make me do anything. Like, what are you gonna do? And that power leaving the state, the traditional nation state, that's up there. I think it's the mining and just how the environment literally and figuratively and literally is going to change, and then also just the ungovernable nature that Bitcoin allows you to be. I guess that to me. What is the aspect? Is it one of those, or what's your favorite part of Bitcoin?
I mean, my favorite part of Bitcoin is, frankly, like this spiritual awakening that like it seems to activate in a bunch of people. And like it's such a strange phenomenon that's like hard to find its locus, but like, I've met and talked with hundreds of people at this point in time that have sort of independently had their own sort of spiritual awakening through Bitcoin, and it allowing for them to go through this dark night of the soul of trying to reason about like what's going on with this system of power and fiat, and like the total impossibility of escaping it, but then finding Bitcoin and seeing this light of like how it can allow for empowerment and this way to actually like actively fight the system. And it's like very real and personal economic liberation that it gave to people that really believed ideologically in it, quite early on. And really, I guess at the beginning of 2020, I started traveling around going to Bitcoin conferences a lot, because like I had this question in me of like, how often was this coming up, and like, was it really something that was sort of independent, that was like paired with Bitcoin, or was somebody kind of cultivating this conversation? And after visiting like 4 different continents, having conversations with people at dozens of different Bitcoin conferences like this, I can say very confidently that like this is like its own thing that is happening and kind of activating in people through their own process of reasoning with Bitcoin. So much so that like I think the very real process of reasoning all the way through Bitcoin seems to activate a very real and powerful new place inside of people that pairs with that sort of spiritual awakening, if you will. Um, and then to the mining part, like it's just really powerful and incredible that I find it laughable at this point that so often I'll have people that are left identifying environmentalists who are like, well, Bitcoin mining like wastes energy, and it's so laughable because like Bitcoin is literally the only thing we have that actually gets us to a sustainable energy future in a meaningful way. And so almost always we go through this Socratic reasoning exercise where we get 1 or 2 questions deep and they just glitch out. Where it's almost always like, I'm like, oh, like, so like you understand energy markets. Like, first of all, can you tell me what like wasted energy is? And they can't ever identify that. And then I always ask also too of like, well, like, large energy markets frequently go into negative energy pricing because of the fluctuation and volatility that happens in energy usage. So like, what do you think we should do with negatively priced energy? And they're like, huh? And I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. You have like such strong opinions about Bitcoin wasting energy. I would think that like you would have at least rudimentary knowledge of how energy markets function, but it actually sounds like you don't actually know anything about how these markets function. And usually from there, it's go, like I tend to actually have the opinion that like before I should develop an opinion about something, I should at least have some knowledge of how those things function. It seems to me in the same disingenuous way to go and say, something highly racist or bigoted about other religions, that like maybe I should know a little bit about those people before I make a judgment call on them. Just my opinion, though. So it also seems to just have this really powerful module of activating real critical thinking for people in new and different ways. Unfortunately, involving the energy thing, because of how I've found a lot of my friends that identify with kind of more democratic policies don't seem to be too interested in critical thinking. I haven't seen them really go past just getting upset about that kind of stuff, but I have hope that at one point in time they'll really allow for their own curiosity, to allow for them to get past their own political biases, to really consider what these things can do for them.
Yeah, the thing that I never understood was just the energy argument in general. I mean, you had this Malthusian, the Club of Rome, all this stuff, and for decades, global cooling, then it was global warming, then it was climate change, and now it's like energy usage you're attacking. It's just like constantly shifting, like every 10 years or so, every 10, 15 years, and trying to control people, trying to control humans is some type of thing to just convince people they need to be taxed more and they need to be controlled, and just learn, like, goes right along with the learned helplessness, like you said. But just the energy thing in general is always fascinating to me, because it's like, speaking of government run schools, if there was one thing government run schools did, they taught you a decent amount of science. I mean, like, shouldn't people know that, like, energy is everywhere and anywhere? It never goes away. It's always there. It just transitions states. That's all it is. So, like, you're not wasting energy. Like, I can't like waste water. It goes down and it, comes up, gets evaporated. It's into the sky. You can't like get rid of these things. Energy is just there. So that to me just never, it doesn't even pass the smell test. And that's what it's just like, what is going on? How are people so, it's like the scales on their eyes. They can't even see what's right in front of them. That is just something I still to this day can't understand as to,
Well, I think that was the thing that George Orwell pointed out in 1985. It was like that's the whole thing, is that like people deny like what their eyes have in front of themselves. Like that's how powerful the propaganda and ideology is that,
insane.
again, like critical thinking is not the primary component of how these people assemble a worldview, but it is an authoritarianism that they've been told about. And like I find it really disturbing at how often I'll ask people just to engage in an exercise with me, to be like, okay, like sure, like global warming is absolutely 100% happening, but if we were being lied to about it, how would they present that? And what could we actively look at on our own to try to transform our own understanding of that? And it's interesting because a lot of times, like, they don't want to follow me down that line of reasoning, and like, this is sort of where I get into it with them. I go, look, like, I think questioning everything is really important, because maybe there's things going on in the world that we don't actively understand, or that people could be lying to us about. I'm like, I remember very specifically, I had a good friend of mine talking about like demonic entities and the idea of how like those could function in the world. And at first it was like, this is laughable. Like we can't entertain that. But he was like, well, like if they did function in the world, like how, like they'd be invisible. Like we wouldn't have like an active way of reasoning or seeing this. So like how could we tell that? And I just remember, because it was someone I really respected, I actually took a step back being like, that's actually like a really great question. And because he was like, look, like it seems like they would act in a way that would allow for there being a fundamental break in reasoning somewhere, and for that reasoning usually to be highly egotistical in a way that manipulates people. So like, don't we see a lot of that with people that seem to be like sociopathic, that like might be attached to some kind of demonic entity? And that was really the first time that like I allowed for myself to zoom out enough to go, I actually don't know if that's true or not, but like I'm going to be skeptical and entertain that. And I've just found like that's a valuable worldview. Like same thing with like, look, maybe XRP could become like the global world currency. Like okay, like I'll take that on for a second, but like let's take a step back and think about like, does having the fixed supply that was created in the beginning valuable? Like, maybe. Like, what's actually securing the system long term? Oh, like I have to like trust all of these nodes that like they're not going to lie or be able to be bribed or economically incentivized because of the way that they function. And like that's all it is. It's just skeptical reasoning. Like this goes all the way back to classic Platonic values. And that's kind of the funniest thing, in my opinion, is that like we're not doing anything radical or new. In fact, like we're just returning to some of the oldest and the most classic values. And that's why the process of Socratic reasoning is like so powerful, is that like if you just dig at things by asking a few successive questions, like you can get pretty far into your understanding of stuff that, one, people that claim that they seem to really know what they're talking about, you realize how full of shit they are. But like you can also with yourself realize how much you believed and were convinced that you knew something to be true, that it turns out once you engage in that line of reasoning and questioning, that it turns out maybe you're not actually as confident as you should be. And I think that those are really, really healthy methods and ways to try to gain a greater understanding of the world. Because if we don't ask that of ourselves, like we're going to have to trust other people, which like, again, returns us to kind of the whole concourse of the conversation and the very real dangers of trusting people that shouldn't be trusted with really important stuff that we have to take self-responsibility for.
Yeah, well said. We've pushed up against this topic a tiny bit throughout this, but just quantum computing, kind of AI. What are your thoughts just going forward on how these worlds kind of mesh together with Bitcoin, and in your eyes, how this kind of comes together and how they work in conjunction together?
Well, first of all, because of the way that SHA-256 functions, like it's quantum resistant on its own. So like unless in quantum computing somehow like you can magically guess this, whatever it is, like 2 to the 50 raised to the 56 power automatically, like that's going to, like, it's kind of a non-issue. Same thing with AI, because like it needs to use general computing as opposed to something like an ASIC. But with that being said, like the actual energy quantity that goes into it is really powerful. And so like AI just sucks up as much energy as it can use. And so like I can imagine people essentially having like dual Bitcoin mining AI servers that kind of swap off and on between the two of them when the AI is getting used and when it's not getting used. Because like the other one that's really interesting is like ASIC mining is almost like it's like autistic computation. Like it's just a really, really efficient way of trying to like find these numbers. So it's like an autist counting beads or something. Like they're super good at counting those beads, but like any other computational thing you want them to do, like they cannot do. And also, like, I think essentially having this energy component to counterbalance AI will be really powerful, just because there will be a very real economic value outside of AI with high energy usage, so that AI won't just be sucking that up. In addition to, it's kind of hard to describe, but essentially there being this alternative use for energy that isn't just about AI and the way it can counterbalance it, I think is pretty important. Not to mention that like these things have a lot to do with one another. And so like I think people essentially having these sort of dual like essentially a server that's going to host both Bitcoin miners and like GPUs to be able to use and counteract with each other, so that like you just have a steady flow of energy that you're always using. And the choice will just be between, are you doing computations with your AI or are you just mining Bitcoin? And I think like that'll become a really, really powerful model considering where and what we're doing. In addition to the fact of that, like now the route to just develop energy for the sake of developing energy is something on its own, which I think is really important, because like here in America, I don't think we've built a new nuclear reactor in like 20 years. Like it's like pretty disturbing how long it has been since we've developed new nuclear reactor technology. And like this is something that should have been started being developed in the 1950s pretty radically and robustly, but because we went in this sort of insane and stupid direction of to be clear, like Gen 1 nuclear power plants, like or Gen 1 nuclear power plants, in my opinion, were like retarded, and that's why we got stuff like Chernobyl. And it just seems very stupid to have a design where it's like at its failing that it's not going to create a nuclear catastrophe. Whereas the Gen 3 nuclear power plants that have been developed, like they can shut down at ease. Like there's very little risk of nuclear meltdown. In addition to, we have stuff like thorium salt reactors that like developing all of this will provide a new substrate for a high energy population that we can use for not only Bitcoin mining, but also for using AI computations, which very clearly is going to become something really powerful and important in the future. So I feel hugely optimistic in a way that I've never felt before, both on the mining front and also on sort of the political institution investor front. And so it's kind of funny that we've just been hanging out at like between 90 and 100K for the last few months, because like I don't know why it hasn't ran super hard. And the best I can say is that like this is what it's felt like before every pretty big bull pump, is that like it goes up to an all-time high, it kind of hangs out around that range for several months, and then it rips hard. So I think stuff is going to be pretty exciting soon here.
Yeah, it's funny. I wanted to bring up nuclear, so you already touched on it and get your thoughts on that. But is it in your introspection, just kind of looking and researching the topic, just energy in general? I mean, is it oil, big oil, that's been stopping a lot of this for a long time? Like you said, it's for decades. It just seems like we're in this stalemate, talking about stalemate with price here of Bitcoin, but also just like this weird world where it feels like fiat has put us in this modern dark age because we pulled so much prosperity out of the future into the now that we haven't given ourselves this ability to actually, and then spend a lot of that going to war and just killing each other instead of actually producing. People are like, well, we have the internet now. It's like, yeah, but you don't even know what we could have had if we would have just been saving prudently and had sound money, et cetera, et cetera. So it feels that way, where it's like, I remember a while back, I just was like sitting there thinking or writing or doing something. I was just like, man, we're living in a modern dark age right now. People are going to look back 100 years from now, 200 years from now and be like, what the hell are you guys doing with this fiat BS and degenerate, looting? Like,
I think calling it a modern dark age is quite accurate, because like it very much like in the dark ages, people got deeply embedded in their own rigid authoritarian systems where like it's not connected to logic in any meaningful way, but it's about this larger overarching view of what the correct authorities have. It utilizes this sort of tandem approach of that, like, sure, big oil's probably suppressed it a bit, but also there's been an environmental movement that's really brought up the question of safety and security and danger. There's been the security state of like not wanting those developments to happen outside of its purview. So like there's been this whole series of things that have participated together, all of which rely on using fear and authority as the main means to sort of suppress greater and more radical thought. Because yeah, like if we did take this alternative direction after World War II, where we were like, yeah, like we're going to just develop energy as robustly and quickly as we can. We're going to really double down and commit ourselves to the scientific process and like what humanity needs and how to open ourselves up to that. Like things could have been totally different, like it's really insane to think about like, what if Henry Wallace had actually been FDR's vice president as he was in the first and second terms in his third term? Like what happens if Truman didn't get into office? Because like Henry Wallace had extremely progressive views and actually ran for the presidency on the Progressive Party ticket, and so stuff would have been radically different. And with that being said, like I don't think we'd actually get to the outcome that we are right here, because this is one of those ironies of that. Like I think Bitcoin only really worked in the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis. And I think that's why Satoshi embedded that message in the Genesis block, is that like Bitcoin only makes sense in a world where we went through the entire arc of fiat development and what that meant. And I think it was only through there being an entire class of people like you and me. Like I graduated from college in 2008 too. Like so did one of my best friends who we're going to be co-founding a startup together. Like we all did everything as we were told. We walked the line, we followed the authority. We got to the finish line and we're like, all right, like time to go get my great high paying job that my college degree. Oh, the entire economy's on fire. And the only thing that I can do is a hard labor job. Oh, like that's what I did all this for. And like that, I don't know about you, but like it put a very significant chip on my shoulder of where I was like, fuck these people. Like I did everything that I was supposed to do and they just ripped me off at the end because they decided that their piggy bank wasn't working the way that they wanted to. So they were going to push a big fat reset button on the system, bail themselves out to the tune of, $300 billion, which at the time was the largest amount of money that we had injected into the system, which now is like a Tuesday.
I think it was like 750. Yeah, it was like 750. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is like the equivalent of what we sent over to Ukraine
like
or something now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. But like
Oh man.
this system really betrayed us, and I think that was a really important step to making us be open to an alternative. And so I think with that being said, again and again, you'll meet people that are just around our same age that had a very similar experience that, was, while very painful and difficult, really important for us to go, oh, this whole system of trusting authority first as delivering on legitimacy is just a lie. And it turns out when that lie is no longer convenient, they'll absolutely renege on it. And so I think that left a lot of us with a bad taste and suspicion in our mouth to be like, how can we find a new system where truth, not authority, becomes the finer purveyor of legitimacy? And it turns out that Bitcoin, with the functions and the gracefulness of how that system was built, really provides a system of proof of work that legitimizes itself through a proof of work process. And we can trace that entire chain of proof of work and how and why it operates and its thoughtfulness and reasonability for it.
So Bitcoin, for all intents and purposes, are going to be, already is, but and just continue to demonetize the different asset classes and really the jobs. A lot of jobs, we talk about AI, 3D printing, nuclear, a lot of things that are happening. And it's truly wild when you look at what's happening. I mean, obviously Jeff Booth talks about this all the time, his great book, and that's his thing that he goes off and talks about all the time. And it's when, like, what are your thoughts, on Bitcoin security, in a way, like Bitcoin? And I'm talking like for the person, like wrench attacks. Like, do you think we'll see, because at some point the professional class, the grifters, the Wall Street bros, like we were just alluding to, like when we were graduating college, these guys were golden parachuting themselves, they're getting bailouts, and that's what woke us up. And people are just having these moments now with COVID, 15 years after that. And at what point, like, do these guys get demonetized to the point where, like, they don't have jobs? You have professional class guys now swinging hammers, literally, because that is the job to get. They are doing manual labor because, by the way, there's no one doing those things. I mean, you can't, try to go build a house right now or try to go do things because there's no one that does it under, 35 years old, 40 years old. And when do the deck chairs really start to get shuffled around to, the economy starting to reorganize itself and become this state of equilibrium? I guess that's the thing I think is amazing to me. And it's probably a couple decades of this happening, but that to me is like the game I'm here for.
Yeah, I think, I think it gets really kicked off in this next 4-year cycle. And I think what's going to happen is that because like right now, the economy is completely distorted in the most asinine direction.
Mm-hmm.
Like the fact that you have people pushing a couple buttons, being able to outmake by many folds, people that are actually putting in hard 10 to 12 hour jobs of labor and really doing the work. They've shortcutted the system in a way that's been really awful. And it's sort of hilarious that like AI takes a large chunk in ending that. Cause like, like now if like you open up, like you can take DeepSeek and you can do something called vibe coding, where it's just like you just vibe with the AI, being like, yeah, build me this, like build me. You don't need any coding skills. You just kind of keep telling it to build the crap that you want it to see, and it'll eventually vomit it out. And so like, and to be clear, like a lot of people that are like software engineers, like they just are copy and paste editors that build half-assed websites that the AI does much more skillfully. So like, these people now are structurally unemployed, but also like the entire financial class starts to become structurally unemployed. And like, while this seems problematic on its face, it's the same structural employment that we had with bank tellers in the 1980s with ATMs. Like, and I think with that being said, as we watch the employment structures restructuring in ways, people will be like, oh, it turns out like me building a house is like this highly profitable thing that like I should probably get involved with in some way, and furthermore, it'll be like, turns out that like me doing a flooring job is something that like robotics is actually going to really struggle with doing flooring correctly, or tiling, or there's going to be like a bunch of weird asinine stuff that furthermore, like as we develop into this economy, I think one of the most beautiful things that it's not going to replace are human relationships. And I think people being able to engage in business human relationships and to, facilitate whatever they're doing through an AI or a robot or whatever is really going to change how the economy functions in a really positive and powerful way. And I also think that there's a really large danger in this, that there will be a certain subclass of people who will just be like, I can't do anything better than a robot. So like the state needs to like give me my handout. And those are going to be the same people that are going to argue for that, like, we need to make sure that the entrepreneurial class is paying their fair share, which, is going to take us off on this other strange direction for a bit. But with that being said, like, I think that these are tools that are highly empowering and moving towards that direction of the price of tomorrow. And, what the very real price of tomorrow is shifting the economy back into this state of real equilibrium. That, like, I actually think something that's going to become a very profitable endeavor for a lot of people is small scale farming. Like, I think it turns out, like, you giving a shit about how you grow your food and your meat and providing that to your community. And like, these aren't big operations, like I belong to a CSA, and like, I think there's like 60 people that belong to it. And like, we get all kinds of great lettuces and vegetables and different local things that are grown here. It's not a super high price point, and it provides for my community in a pretty meaningful way. And I know the people that are growing it really care about what they're giving us, and like, they're using great crop inputs. They're not dumping a bunch of fertilizer and stuff on it. They're not spraying it with glyphosate. And like, these are all really great things that also, it doesn't scale in a massive way. Like, it's actually kind of a difficult thing to scale. And that's good, because like, now there's more people that can go and participate in those things. As for people that like want to get on the gravy train, like, that's going to become a harder and harder thing, that it's going to turn out that there isn't really a proof of stake method in the world any longer. Like, you're actually going to have to do the proof of work to be able to generate meaningful bit flow, because most people are going to be on a Bitcoin standard. And that's going to be one of the reasons why people can actually acquire a savings, and why this economy is going to function in a new way, because companies that have bit flow are going to be more valuable than companies that just have standard cash flow.
Wow. Last couple here. I know we're going for about 2 hours now. This is just incredible talk, Erik. What are your thoughts on just, we talked about, Tether with their, the extending dollar dominance and, CBDC stuff, but, the UBI thing that really kind of came about, a while ago, and, rears its head here and there. But are we going to live in a world where there is this, like, kind of like bimetallism in a way, where you have like people on government fund coupons over here, like living off the state in a way, and there's Bitcoin over here, and then eventually just Bitcoin just kind of consumes all of it? Like, is it, because you're, like Nolan Bowerly talks about this all the time, like, with just like, you're going to have, the normies here and the NPCs, and then like the Bitcoiners just keep growing, and people are starting to come to the light and having the spiritual awakening, and there's like, what the hell? And then they're just the people that are left, like, is that how it's going to kind of transition?
Yeah, I honestly think that that's probably going to be like a 30-year time scale, where essentially, and that's why CBDCs and UBIs, like, it's going to work really well, is because a lot of people are going to be like, I don't know about this digital dollar thing. And then we'll be like, how about your 500 free dollars that you get for signing up for Tether? And they're going to be like, right, like, I'm all in. And meanwhile, we'll be like, this is stupid. And to me, like, this is how and why Bitcoin's going to go to 2 million, to 20 million, to 200 million, to 2 billion, to 20 billion, like, on and on. And people, let's see, I got it right here. My golden reserve of Zimbabwe. This is a $100 billion note. It's hard to see with the reflection, but so like, there's no reason that we don't go to that. And I know that seems very absurdist to most people, but like, that system can function on and on and on. And what's really interesting about using something like Tether and a CBDC system is that instead of us going into just full hyperinflation, you can actually pump the brakes pretty hard on that. So you just have something like 200% inflation for like 30 years, as opposed to hitting a place where you have like 1,000,000,000% inflation in 1 year. And so I think like, that's going to be the model. And the saddest thing is that like, I think the poor, disempowered individuals that aren't going to be able to contribute in a larger, meaningful way in society, like, that's going to be a good model for them to get their UBI, for them to get a very basic amount of food and rent and stuff, and for, that to be a functional model, and like, while I would prefer for them to feel deeply empowered and to go find what their meaning and purpose in the world is, I think that they're probably not going to be a person that thinks that way or really wants to turn themselves on in that way. So, that'll be their choice, and that'll be the method that will function. But I do think it's rather unfortunate and sad. But, as my big thing I've had to learn in Bitcoin is just like, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, and I think Savetsky was the one that popularized the idea of Isaiah's job, is that it's really important that Isaiah wasn't out there preaching to the general populace. He was really interested in preaching to those that would actually accept the saving word of Christ and what it meant if they were to have a job in that. And so for me, I'm not interested in talking to normies to get on the Bitcoiner train. I'm interested in talking to people that know and understand what Bitcoin is and getting them to commit harder and to be more invested in that system, because this is the only option that we have for a meaningful future, and again, my job is to debate with the Ripple retards, because they're almost there. They're just really struggling to get some of these other components of it, of that, why it's really important that there is a fixed supply that isn't controlled by somebody that's a known individual, and why the idea of building a central bank digital currency on top of Ripple is a pretty dangerous idea for most people, and why it is not a censorship resistant system in any meaningful way. I hope they're open to that debate, and I hope that number go up isn't their main component. But as for the time being, I don't think that that'll be true with most people I talk to about that.
Yeah, it really feels like the states are that Trump broke the media 8 years ago, and really started exposing that, right? Cracked it and then really kind of busted it wide open, which to me was the win of the Trump presidency 8 years ago. And then now it feels number one, it's wild to see what you learn, right? When you you can remove yourself for 4 years and prep to get back in. It's a story of all of us, right? How much wiser you are 4 years later, and to not be in power and just kind of see, what did I do wrong? What can we do different? And just hitting the ground running. That to me is kind of the story of a way of just leadership almost, and reflection. So that I think that's one of these things you take out of Trump and what's happening right now, because it's a feel I've never seen in my life, just personally, right? It's something that is just totally outside there. But the states part too, I'd love your thought on the states, this strategic Bitcoin reserve stuff with the states. What do you see just between the states taking their autonomy back, maybe Bitcoin being a part of that? What is your hope, or what do you see there?
My hope, which I think is probably pretty different from how it plays out, is I would love for states to really get on and actually create their own Bitcoin strategic reserve, using that as an asset to essentially empower themselves against the federal government. Wyoming, for example, they already have their own sovereign wealth fund, which I think it funds something like a third of the state's budget. So it's clearly very successful. And you figure if a number of states get on board and have their own strategic reserve, that provides a really great source of funding for states to be able to provide for themselves. And if you actually limit the federal government and pretty much be look, you guys are going to inflate us to infinity, there becomes a pretty interesting way that states can allow for the withering of the federal government and sort of start replacing a lot of their services and be able to fund that. I'm not sure if states are really going to get on board with that, in addition to you have a problem with the coastal elite states, clearly. And for me, this is also one of the more disturbing things is that I would have thought the dictum between the right left would have started breaking down. But it's actually been pretty disturbing to see how sophisticated the propaganda is, because you turn on NPR right now and they're like, Trump hates poor people and wants everyone to starve to death, and it's like I understand that's what you believe about USAID, but when you dig in, is $20 million for Sesame Street in Iraq, is that actually feeding poor people? And if we did give a shit about poor people, maybe that $20 million would be better used for something else. And it did, because so far from what I've seen, pretty much all of these corruption programs haven't, none of them seems to have been providing any real value outside of trying to deepen left ideological ideas in other countries, which goes to show that not only is this not just to feed a bunch of poor people, but it is specifically trying to go in and wreck other countries that have a more conservative culture, and that's pretty disturbing. So you'd think with some of that there would be a little bit of investigation, But in the famous words of Osho, like the people are retarded. So I don't have. Well, and it's hard because like this is a problem I've had with my own family. Is like I really want to like dig into this stuff and have good
Mhm.
dialogue with them about it, but I've realized like they're not actually interested in the truth. Like they're really interested
Yeah.
in what feels good. And it feels really good to believe that USAID is just feeding poor people around the world and that America is this excellent bastion of freedom that has only gone around presenting and spreading, nice, warm, fuzzy feelings. When the truth is, it seems that like we're actually using that as a cover for CIA operations. And, like it's kind of disturbing, but if you dig into the facts, that seems to reveal itself. And as far as I can tell, a lot of leftists aren't really interested in that, but they're much more interested in their own narrative. So, yeah, with that being said, I think we're just going to see that kind of get more and more extreme. And this is also that weird flip that we saw between now and 20 years ago is like, I used to identify with far left people because they were like anti-war, freedom of speech. Like these
Mhm.
are uncompromising principles, which is like
Yep.
now the opposite. So it's pretty disturbing to see how that line of reasoning is played out or lack of reasoning.
Yeah, boy, oh boy, it is wild when you see how it's just been turned on its head like that. Do you think that the USAID or USAID, I don't even know how you pronounce it, which one it
Yeah, I
is
think it
actually,
can
but
pronounce either way.
either way, um, is that? Do you think a lot of that is money laundering, or is it CIA op type stuff, colored revolution, or is it like is it both? Like, what's your take? I haven't done a ton of studying. I'll say this, and I was talking to you offline before. 25 years ago, this was like it was obvious to me. Like you're reading like Agenda 21, like all these different things. Like in theory, these things work great on paper. Like we had in hockey, you have a saying of like you can't just throw your sticks on the ice. Like, hey, our roster is better than this guy's their roster. Like we're gonna kick their ass. Like this is easy. You got to go play the game still. And if you have this mindset of like we can just defeat anyone, we can do anything. Well, good luck. And that's kind of like I always looked at like socialism or communism that way. Like on paper, it's amazing. Like utopia, like everything is equal. Like, yeah, that's great. But in theory, when you play it out with human beings, that's just not how the game works.
Yeah, I think specifically the case with USAID, because like it's one of the largest organizations that uses money abroad to like spread American interests, if you will. I think
Yeah.
it started out like pretty well intended, and then I think the
Mm-hmm.
CIA figured out that they could sponsor
Slush
black
fund.
ops through that, and then I think a lot of people understood that they could get because like this is the same way it's played in classic politics is that like you can
Mm-hmm.
just amend on sort of whatever your little pet project is. And we haven't really had any thoughtful review of this for like 50 years. So like as that gained progress, like pretty much everybody was like, yeah, I'll tag on my transgender play. I'll put
Mm-hmm.
in sex change surgeries for people in Guatemala. I'll like the whole litany
Yep.
of whatever insane project you want to had just got amended and like got approved because like this it's not like there's any true like democratic oversight that happens in this, which is also like the hilarious part of the media freaking out with them being like, Elon Musk wasn't elected. And I was like, well, were any of these other people at any of these other organizations elected? Because like, look, if you want to have a conversation about like unelected officials having too much power, like I'd love to talk with you about the IRS. And they're like,
Mm-hmm.
and it's interesting because like I think we're just going to keep going in this direction of more and more extremism. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're hearing larger and larger screechings coming from the left, specifically around freedom of speech, is because if we're forced to have a real and sincere dialogue about what it is that America is supposed to be and represent, they're going to have a really hard time with that because I think a lot of people, and I think this is more extreme even for conservative people, but at least the line of reasoning makes more sense, is that like, yeah, the federal government is massive and it needs to be slashed by 95% and it needs to be really forced back into a corner to where like it can't do a bunch of stuff that it's been doing for a very long
Mm-hmm.
time. And I think because that's happened for so long, most people forget that like the federal government is actually supposed to be constrained not only by states, but like simply by what's constitutionally enumerated to them. And anything that isn't given to them is supposed to be a state's right as explicitly stated in the 10th Amendment. So I would love for us to actually return to that. I would love for states to start bullying the federal government and pretty much telling them, no, we're not going to give you any money for this crap because we don't believe in any of it. And we see how corrupt you are. And it would be really great to see if Trump gets in line with that, which frankly, at this point in time, seems like a very real possibility. But yeah, I do worry about the kind of screeching that happens on the left, because they don't actually really seem, again, like, it's very disturbing to me. Like, they don't seem to be terribly interested in core values and sort of talking about what those core values are. Because, like, one of the things that hasn't made any sense to me is the support of the Ukraine war from start to finish. Like, it seems like a gigantic money laundering operation that wants to force Eastern European men into a meat grinder. And, like, that's just not a value I have, particularly considering that, you know, most people couldn't point Ukraine out on a map. And even if they could, they absolutely can't point out any of their neighbors. So, like, it just seems pretty odd to me that, like, you want to support a lot of people in that area of the world being killed, as opposed to, like, why don't we keep our money here at home and, like, say, support homeless veterans? That seems like a good idea. But I don't know, maybe I'm missing something.
It was someone earlier. I don't know if it was Thomas Massey himself. I think it might have been, actually. Oh yeah, I do have it right here, actually.
Massey's pretty legit.
Yeah, I mean, he seems pretty legit. And, you know, he said, I'm concerned that the House and Senate will fully fund USAID in March, just like we did in December. I voted no. The argument from Republican leadership will be that they need Democrat votes to pass an omnibus or CR bill, continuing resolution bill, to avoid a government shutdown. The fact that this is even a thing right now is mind-blowing. I mean, people are like blowing up right now, and it's like they're just like, oh yeah, business as usual. Like, what? Like, it's insane. I mean, people are talking about, you know, like, why am I paying my taxes right now? Which is, again, what a lot of us have been saying for years in a way. And it's like, it feels like all you need is like remember, like, back in the day, they had like the Facebook, like 10, 12 years ago, like flash mobs, and people would get together like on a Facebook group and be like, hey, this day, this time, we're going to have a flash mob in the mall, you know, whatever. And they'd all break down, start dancing and whatever the hell they were doing. It's like the same thing. Like, just, we're not paying taxes today. Like, just get a couple million people and be like, we're not paying. Like, what are you going to do? Put us all in jail? Put us all in prison? Good luck. Like, it's insane.
I mean, like, the only thing that disturbs me is challenging that, because, like, it's like, what are you going to do? Shoot us? And it's like, uh-oh, maybe they will. But, like, I do think we're moving more and more in that direction. And that's one of the really powerful things about Bitcoin is, like, if people choose to actually engage in a thoughtful construct of tax resistance, there's a meaningful way to resist. And there are a number of smaller tax resistance movements that have gained traction. I know that there's one based out of Oregon and a few other places. But to me, it's really clear that, like, this idea of an orange party, or of like some sort of state-based party that's really about, it's not about right or left anymore, but frankly, it's just about like, what are these sort of core middle values that all Americans share? And, like, I think that those things actually have like a lot more credence, but because the screeching of the media, the manipulation and propaganda has been so powerful, that people will identify so strongly with these extremist positions, whereas people need to be like, look, like, we need to just get back to a middle ground of that, like, every American should have the freedom of speech. They should have the ability to own firearms to be able to resist, you know, overreach from a federal government. They should be able to have a real right against search and seizure. And it's really interesting how much Bitcoin is really contained in the heart of the first 5 amendments of the United States Constitution, how important that is. And, like, this is sort of one of my great hopes, is that people start really understanding the sovereignty that cryptography truly provides, and start building new organizations around this, and being like, hey, we're going to keep all of our data encrypted. We're going to use new forms, you know, like Nostr and other things, to be able to make sure that we have freedom of speech. Like, we're not going to be dealing with these corporations anymore. Like, you know, whether it's Facebook or X or Instagram, it's very clear all of them have their own algorithmic biases. In addition to the fact, if the feds come to them and go, hey, cut these people off and censor them, they'll absolutely do that. And that's deeply disturbing, because there's a lot of people out there that have really powerful and important things to say who get censored. And, like, if you deny that, just look 5 years ago when people were active online going, hey, like, this experimental mRNA vaccine, like, seems to have some damaging qualities, seems to have maybe been a bio leak. And, like, I don't know about you, but I very clearly remember when people said, hey, we think this was leaked from a lab in China. Like, they were laughed at, they were ridiculed, they were canceled. It was made, you know, their voice was silenced. And now if you look in the traditional media, they're saying, yeah, actually, it turns out that's probably where it was from. And, like, that's really, really disturbing. And we now have the technology and the techniques to be able to actually own our own media and be able to share with that openly. And I think it's really important that whatever new political movement that people seem to be very hungry for integrates those sort of ideas. Yeah, and more it seems that people are pretty open to the idea of being done with this right-left bullshit with federal politics overwhelmingly state politics. And so I do think it's time for something new to happen, and I really hope and cheer on anybody that wants to take that on. Like I'm a bit preoccupied with some of my own stuff that, not to mention, politics always. I don't think I'd be a good politician, so like I'm not interested in doing that. Like I go into like an extreme fascist direction. Like I'm not really interested in having dialogue and like doing all of the politicking. Like I'm just interested in kind of seizing power and throwing distance into like whatever sort of offshore Guantanamo prisons I have. So don't vote for me. I'd be a bad choice.
We sure could use some of the Eric the rants, like when someone's like, can you imagine like a lady or someone like turning on CNBC and then all of a sudden you're there like in the Senate floor just like just lighting people up. I mean, that's but that'd be incredible.
I was afraid that when they were going to do Tulsi's confirmation hearing, that they were going to get like clips of me and Valis's dialogue with her. It'd just be like, you're like talking to this insane anarchist guy. Like, we can't have you be part of the national security state.
Oh man, yeah, that was like the next couple slides. They cut it off right before that. They were right there almost. Yeah, it's crazy to think like George Washington, just to be clear, talked about this. Don't get into the red versus blue. I mean, that wasn't at the time the red versus blue, but don't get into this two-party system. Don't get into this fake prison of two ideas. It does really feel like it's the American Revolution again, this second American Revolution, where you have the couple percent of the people who they're called to do it, quite honestly. There's no other way to say it really. And I think you talked about this in one of their pods. It was just like this. I always think of the Crucible. Alex Stanzik always would talk about this too. And like the military, like a lot of men feel compelled to be in the military. And I know I did for a long time, want to be a Navy SEAL, want to be a fighter pilot, chose the hockey route. And it is just like, I always have that like, and it's like, for men, it's just like that crucible of like wanting to help and serve other people and protect other people. And Bitcoin is that vehicle where a lot of us are doing that, but it does feel like the American Revolution was only a couple percent of people, and most people are British loyalists. They're Tories, like they're just like, oh yeah, whatever. They're ratting on the Patriots, like they're in there, and it's like at the same time, it's the Bitcoiners, only a couple percent people we need to get to that will drag the rest of humanity across the finish line. It's not going to be like, oh, 65% of the people agree with us. I think that's what's this thing. Like in saying all that, do you think will there be a point where people will be like, oh, these people, they have too much? I mean, you can see a little bit here and there, but will there be some pushback, do you think, where it's people are like, oh, like what are these Bitcoiners doing? You can see it from the top.
Yeah, but like it's going to be like such a lettuce hand thing that at that point, like that's going to be, in my opinion, that'll be like kind of the final thing, like as because to me it's already very clear that like Bitcoiners are the vanguardists of like this new technological political elite. And that like part of that, we probably need to make an alliance with like the far right tech elite. And the irony is that like we'll totally stab them in the back at the end, and it'll be hilarious because they'll be like, wait, I thought you were going to deploy our surveillance system. We're like, no, like, we're like destroying your surveillance system permanently. Like that's, yeah, like you're retarded for thinking that we're going to do that. And like in that, they'll also be like, these Bitcoiners are just enriching themselves with, making Bitcoin the premier asset class. And like, we need to steal from them. And we'll be like, well, like, come and take it. Like, please show me how you're going to get all of my Bitcoin from me. And like, you can show up with a bunch of violent people with guns and knives and all sorts of things. And all that you're probably going to do is activate a bunch of insane assassination contracts that are going to find your heads on pikes. So good luck if you want to do that. And I think like, that final move into this sort of powerful viewpoint of we go, look, the state and money need to be separated. Like the government needs to use Bitcoin as a vehicle and to actually have a real treasury. But like, we need that more importantly to actually return the power of the purse to the people. Like what's been happening for the last 70 years is utter insanity. Like the United States government is supposed to actually be accountable to the people in some meaningful way. And like the USAID thing that we've been talking about is very clear that like, there is no accountability there because they can just readily and freely print out money and make sure that it is universal income for the wealthy and the politically connected, and that is going to be done at the expense of the general populace, and that there is no meaningful vehicle of Democratic or Republican, like in the classic sense of either having the grand population vote on it or representatives that we've elected vote on it in any meaningful way. So like, I think it's really important and powerful for people to realize that like Bitcoin is not like, this isn't like a contemporary political ideal. This is like a capital T, capital P, the political. Like, this is about what does it mean to have property? What does it mean to have law? Like, what is the actual philosophical connotation of these things, and what do those things mean? And so I think as people contemplate and consider what these ideals mean in a much larger sense, I think more and more people are going to come to going like, okay, like these guys actually have a meaningful solution that can allow for us a big reset of a lot of the problems that are happening in our current political paradigm, and allow for us to renew in a very powerful and meaningful way the political through a technological approach that not only allows for the American dream to flourish in America, but for us to really actively spread that to the rest of the world, and what it means for somebody in, Guyana Biasu to be able to actually have law, what it means for somebody in China to be able to freely speak their mind, what it means for an inventor in Pakistan to be able to actually invent what he wants to and not have the state come and steal it. And to me, like, that's sort of the big underlying political process, is that like, I now have true solidarity with my values with people all over the globe. And frankly, like, that's what Americanism is. Like, despite the fact that we may have been here in America for a generation or two, we're all truly immigrants. And that, like, I want anybody who really actively shares in the values of what Americanism is to be able to have the same buy-in to Bitcoin as I do. And they actually do now, because of what Bitcoin is and how it represents and presents itself in the world. So yeah, I think, and the other one is like, Bitcoin's only 16 years old. Like, we're winning so hard at this point in time that like, it's kind of exhausting. So like, I can't imagine that another 16 years passes and that like, we haven't dramatically changed the outcome of the global political landscape. So a lot of it is just keep pushing forward.
Man, so beautifully said. I was ironically, like, you answered my last question basically, which was why keep doing this, right? Like we were saying earlier, like, we don't have to. There's other things we could be doing, spending time with family, starting other businesses, doing other things. And it's like, why do you keep feeling called and pulled back to go to conferences, go to get onto podcasts, do whatever it is, run a podcast, whatever it is. It's like, why do you do this? Like, it could just have a good life, could just watch a number go up over time and just be like, yeah, like, great, see, you told everyone, awesome.
Some will choose that, but the truth is those of us that are participating here, like, we know that call inside of us that, like, maybe it's the secret voice of God, maybe it's something else, but like, there's this very real purpose that summons us, that we know when we sit still and go, like, I could do something here, I could participate. And like, that's really meaningful, and like, it's been troubling and disturbing for me, because on a lot of levels, I do just want to hang out with my family and kids and not do anything. But I also see that like, there's something bigger going on. And then when I go and I do connect and I do have these conversations, like, I just got back from El Salvador, where like, I was just hanging out with a bunch of Bitcoiners, and we were just rapping super deep about cryptography and the future and politics. And it really nourished my soul and rejuvenated me in a way that like, I don't get out in normie land. Like, I can't have that conversation at, a barbecue where my kids play t-ball with the other parents. And it's because like, there isn't a deeper sense of purpose and a connection to like, what we're really trying to accomplish in the world. It's just really about the struggle to survive and the sort of superfluousness that's involved with that. So for me, it's really about this deeper connection to meaning and purpose and being that I get by experiencing other Bitcoiners and seeing and knowing that like, we truly have a vision for, a millennia from now. And what if we do this right means not only to our children, our grandchildren, but, successive generations down the line for all of posterity. And it's hard because like, when I start talking about the really big picture stuff, like, it seems pretty crazy, but like, we are sincerely talking about the creation of technology that can last forever. And like, that seems really threatening and daunting, but it's truthfully what we're trying to engage in. And so for me, the opportunity to get to build these tools that and work on this philosophy that could be read hundreds of years from now is really meaningful to me. And that's what I want to commit my life and participate in. And I feel really lucky and grateful to get to do it and to get to share and get to have all kinds of great and meaningful conversations, particularly with folks like you, where we can, have never connected or talked before and just be able to get on a pod and just jump right in and dive deep. And, that there's no qualms about that at all. And I've seen that again and again with Bitcoiners.
Wow.
Same thing with some of the guys
Sure.
that showed up in El Salvador. We didn't know any of them. We were all staying at the same place together. And within 5 minutes, we're talking pretty deep about all of this kind of stuff, and there's no hesitation, and it's really beautiful and meaningful. And I think in a world that can feel pretty nihilistic and alienating, like that's kind of the biggest thing going on.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we're blessed to have you in this community, people like you are within El Salvador. It's the couple percent they're going to drag people along. It's unbelievable. What are you working on now? Where can people find you? And any last thoughts?
So I'm working on a stealth startup right now. We'll probably have an announcement like 3 to 6 months, kind of depending on how stuff goes. And still just kind of doing random podcasts and stuff. I'm working on my, my second book, but who knows how long that'll take me. But yeah, I'll be presenting at, the Bitcoin conference in Vegas, which will be pretty fun.
Nice.
I'll have, I'll probably just be hitting up different Bitcoin conferences in between here and there. But ultimately, the stealth startup that I'm working on is sort of the next evolution of collaborative custody that sort of takes the last 10 years of working in the space and my experience with it to the next level. So I feel pretty confident and excited about it. And likewise, I appreciate you being out there spreading the word on your own side. And, it's really this enthusiasm and belief in what we're doing that's really kind of working across the scale. So I think it's important and powerful. If anybody's interested in my book, I have a book called Crypto Sovereignty. You can either go to cryptosovereignty.org. I have a lot of essays published there and a link to the book, or you can find it on Bitcoin Magazine's website as well. And then I'm mostly on Nostr now. I still have an X account. I've told myself I'm going to start using it more, but I just find it such I just find it to be a cesspool that really usually when I come away from it, I feel pretty angry and upset about stuff. Whereas Nostr, it's just all of my cool people hanging out and having friends. So I highly recommend you get a Nostr account if you don't have one. But yeah, and if you have any questions for me, feel free to send me a DM. I'm usually okay about getting back to them. I get lots of messages, so sometimes it's kind of hard to dig through them, but I usually get back to people.
Well, we will link to all that as well. Thank you, brother, for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you on and spend these 2 hours.
Absolutely.
Together. Thank you.
Happy that we finally connected.
If you like this interview we just did with Erik Cason, then you're going to love the one we just did with Top Gun graduate George Bodine. Or you might love the one we just did with Larry Lepard and talking about the big print that is coming that's going to paper over the next crash and what the governments are going to be forced to do. Go check those out here. We look forward to seeing you inside.